Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. Hi, everybody. Okay, I'm reading some comments already. So thank you for being here. I'm Romina. I work for MacMillan Education. And today, together with Mondadori Education, we would like to present the session about microlearning. Before starting and calling our speaker, I would like to remind, let me just check. Okay, I can see people saying hello, hi everyone. If you wish to have a look at the chat and try out the chat, please try and tell me where you're from. So try to speak a little bit with the chat, because the chat will be your way of communicating with the speaker as well. So you can have your questions there, and then we will help you. I will help you with them at the end of the session. I just would like to remind you that you can find your attestati after the session. They will be available in the section attestati on mondadorieducation.it. And then if you would like to receive updates on the whole program and all the next sessions as well, there's a button on the YouTube channel, which is Iscriviti, and by clicking on that, you will be informed about all the next episodes as well. So this is just to remind you of all the technical part, but I would like to welcome our speaker today, Richard. Hello, Richard Twigg is here with us today.
Hi everybody. Nice to see people from different places. Vicenza,
okay.
Lugano.
He should be here with us in a moment. Richard today will speak about microlearning. So, okay. Hi, Richard. Hello.
Hi, how are you doing?
Hi, all good. You? All fine?
Good. Fine, thanks very much.
Fantastic.
Thanks for the invitation.
So, Richard will speak about microlearning today. I will be following together with you. So, again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to type everything in the chat and I'll be helping you out. So thank you very much and see you later. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Let me change my slides to these slides. So you should be able to now see my slides. I unfortunately can't see you, but as Romina is controlling, she will check any questions, any comments. If there are any burning questions that need to be answered, she will interrupt me. But if it's okay with you guys, if you keep your questions towards the end or comments, we can then always go back and revisit them. I'll leave, should I say, a good 15 minutes at the end for questions and discussion, should it be needed. So, as the title of the topic is, microlearning in lower middle school. So let's kick off immediately and start by looking at what microlearning actually is. So I will let you read these lines one by one. Okay, so just to stress here that mainly microlearning is used in the context of e-learning, okay, learning online, but it has been around since the beginning of the 21st century. Okay. And as the second statement says, it covers short-term learning activities with micro content. Okay. And obviously, like most terms nowadays, it can be used in many different ways. and I'm going to put my version or interpretation of microlearning, particularly how we can or you can use it in middle school. So when we look at microlearning in education, the key thing for me is focusing on new information being presented, the students having the opportunity to learn this information, but to learn it in small units, commonly known as bite-sized chunks. So if we use the food analogy, if we have more than a mouthful, it's difficult to swallow. Something that we can bite and chew on is more manageable. So the same kind of idea, the same principle when it comes to learning. The students need to chew on it, they need to swallow it, they need to ingest the information. So a couple of important things. The information therefore needs to be engaging, because if we don't engage the students, we're not sparking their motivation. Without motivation, we have difficulty with regards to the students being interested. And obviously needs to be digestible, because if something is indigestible, we don't take it in. We, like with food, we don't take the goodness out of it. We don't take the important facts out of it if the information is not digestible and we can't process it. This all then leads to improved retention. So we retain more of the knowledge that we are given, or that we see, or that we are taught, or that we encounter. And obviously, at the end of the day, we are empowering the learner. We are giving the learner more knowledge. We are giving them the ability to then be able to work with what they've learned. Hopefully, then they can go on and use that knowledge, that information, whether it be in a test, whether it be later on in life, whatever. We are giving them power. We're giving them information. Okay. But like most things, we tend to forget, and obviously it tends to be, or we tend to think that the older we are, the more we forget. But in actual fact, let's have a look at the learning curve, which was designed by Hermann Ebbinghaus. And here, if we look here, we start off with 100% of the information on the day that we learned it. But look how quickly that line falls or drops. After just 20 minutes, we lose close to 50% of the information. We forget, if we want to use the term forgetting the forgetting curve, we forget 20% within 20 minutes of getting that information. Okay. After one day, we're just over 25%, and after a month, after 31 days, it drops to 20%. Now, this is obviously provided that we have not done anything with the information. If we just hear that information and we don't do anything to reinforce it, as it says at the bottom, we fail to recall, to remember 80% of what we've learned in the last 30 days. If we don't reinforce it, if there's not positive reinforcement, if it's not re-entered, if we don't activate what we call prior knowledge as well. So if it's just presented and never looked at again, we then lose all of that information in a short period of time. Let's look at the learning process itself. Now, obviously, learning has an evolutionary purpose. When we were hunter-gatherers or whatever, we learned in order to evolve. We learn from our mistakes, and hopefully we evolve and we get better and we fine-tune things, and we can then do things now that we couldn't do 100 years ago. But learning itself allowed individuals in the past to survive. Okay, so it was a case of adapt or die. Adapt to the conditions, learn to hunt, to do whatever, learn to avoid danger. Otherwise, you were not going to survive. And what is quite interesting, and I have had a bit of first-hand experience of this, our brains remember important or surprising facts. Now, the reason I say I've had a first-hand experience, I have a mother who, unfortunately, at the moment is completely, should I say demented? I'm not sure, but she has Alzheimer's, full-blown Alzheimer's, if you want to call it that. But some years ago, she came to visit me here in Italy, and she was halfway, should we say. She was forgetting things, she'd remember things. But most things that you tell her memory span was not 20 minutes, it was maybe 5 minutes, okay? But I remember saying something to her, and she remembered something because of the emotion that was attached to it. She felt emotionally shocked, so we could use that surprise, and so that memory stayed longer, and I think for about 20 minutes, half an hour after, she kept reminding more, referring back to it, which is very, very unusual. So it is incredible how the brain can remember certain things. We can be shocked and say, how can I remember that when I can't remember something simple? But normally if something is either perceived as being important, or if there's a surprise element, the brain tends to remember it more or quicker. It's also true that the stronger the emotion, the stronger the memory. And we'll look at emotion and memory a little bit later on. But if we've got a strong emotional connection, the memory tends to be stronger. I'm sure you guys can think how many times you can think of sad, emotional, distressing events tend to stick in your memory more than happy events, normal events, non-emotionally engaging events. If something terrible happened, if you went through a hard time, that memory jumps out at us more often than the good times. We remember the bad times more than we remember the good times. And so that's also something to bear in mind, that's linked with the emotion and memory. But looking at all of that, our survival no longer depends on what we learn. We're not trying to survive in the jungle. I mean, we can say that sometimes our survival might depend, because if we don't pass the exam or we don't finish school, we might have difficulty. But there's not that strong need or desire to adapt or die. So what we need to do is somehow, and this is obviously our role as teachers, we've got to convince the brain, we've got to convince our students to convince their brain that the information is important in some way, and that will then help the brain to remember that information. So just telling them you must learn this because it's going to be in the test isn't necessarily enough. But if we can find some kind of link to something they already know, building some kind of bridge or connection, they can start to see an importance in building that or remembering that. That will then help in remembering. So I've mentioned a little bit about the brain. So let's have a look at the brain itself and learning. So I'm not going to go through the various parts of the brain. I'm not going to bore you with all the anatomical stuff. We're just going to look at these few areas. So there's the PFC, or the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. Okay. So if we look at a picture of the brain, the first one is the prefrontal cortex, front of the brain. Okay. The next one that we look at is the hippocampus, towards the middle of the brain, the back of the brain. Information is flowing through the brain. And we have this little thing called the amygdala, tiny little thing here in the middle. And we're going to look at all three, and we're going to see what their functions are. But I just thought it would be useful to see, for you to just remember. Maybe some of you know, maybe some of you teach biology, just to get an idea of where these parts are that we are talking about. So the prefrontal cortex. It has a wide range of higher order cognitive functions. For example, it helps us to focus our attention. It's the thinking brain, the front of the brain. It's also predicting the consequences. So in the past, when we had the old fight or flight, if I do this, the consequence of this action is this, all happens in this front part of the brain. It also helps us to anticipate events, and it also controls our impulse. Okay, so impulsive thinking, etc. Okay. And we're also starting to manage our emotional, because this is the rational part of the brain, and it helps us to manage our emotional reactions. The back part of the brain, the hippocampus towards the back part, should I say, is involved in memory, learning, navigation, and less importantly for us, navigation and the perception of space. But the hippocampus is there, so it's, if you notice, I've highlighted the fact that it's supporting both memory and learning. Okay, so two different functions, but obviously in learning we need both. Certainly in language learning and other learning, we need to remember the facts that we have learned. But we have our little friend called the amygdala. And the amygdala regulates emotion and memory. Okay? Sometimes, if some of you might have come across it, some people refer to it as the lizard brain. It's the oldest part of the brain. Some people refer to it as the chimp. It's like having a chimpanzee. This amygdala behaves like a chimpanzee in a cage. Okay. And it's associated with the brain's reward system, stress, and also, more importantly or more commonly, the fight or flight response, which goes back to our days as hunter-gatherers, survive, adapt or die. And it responds, or the amygdala responds, when we perceive, and I think this is very important, we perceive that there is a threat to the status quo. Okay. And when the amygdala is there and everything is quiet, I don't know if you remember where it was, but the amygdala is a tiny little almond-shaped part of the brain. And normally it is closed, covered up, everything's fine, and this is in the middle of the brain, and information is flowing backwards and forwards quite happily through the brain. We're quite calm. We're not emotional. Everything is happy. Everything is fine in life. Then this little amygdala senses or perceives a threat, and it gets aroused. Okay. And we now have, hopefully you can see or you can imagine, we've built a wall. So the information is no longer flowing freely from the front to the back of the brain. And the information can't flow again until the amygdala calms down and everything goes back to normal. So we call the fact when the amygdala is aroused, is activated, we call that an amygdala hijack. And for me, maybe the best example is, ladies, I'm going to use your husbands or your partners or your better halves, whatever you want to call them, as an example. He is driving down the road, everything is okay, and the next minute somebody doesn't indicate, somebody pulls out, somebody does something, and they go from being calm, driving carefully, to screaming, shouting, going crazy, getting really angry in a split second, a millisecond. Okay? And it doesn't matter what you say, what you do, they are in this zone. And then maybe 5 minutes later, everything's back to normal. It's like nothing happened. That was the amygdala being triggered. They perceived a threat. The status quo was upset. And until the amygdala is calmed down, there's nothing you can do. Okay? And that stops any kind of transfer, the rational brain basically stops being rational, and it's all about this fight or flight response. So what they've also done, because obviously scientists and we have learned it's not necessarily for survival, but the evolutional process, that they've discovered that when people feel emotional pain, the same areas of the brain get activated when people feel physical pain. And we know that, probably easier to think about physical pain, you have a terrible headache, you hurt yourself, your focus or your attention goes to the source of that pain. That is where your concentration is. If you've cut your finger and you've got pain in your finger, or you have a toothache, or as I said, a headache, that's where the attention goes. But as it says here, they've now discovered that if you feel emotional pain, rejection from your classmates, dare I say it, you feel that you've been told off or you've been chastised by the teacher, some students can react more emotionally than others, and in that case, all of their thinking, all of their concentration goes towards the pain that they are feeling. As if they had some physical pain, the emotional pain does the same, and the brain is then focusing on that. And in that time, they are not concentrating, they're not learning, no information is moving from one part of the brain to the other. Their brain is literally on shutdown. Okay. And obviously here, as I've mentioned before, there are the same regions of the brain were activated when people experience an experimental social rejection from their peers. So it could be something's completely out of your control. They have been rejected, or they think about what happened in the playground or in break or whatever, and that is overwhelming for them. They've been rejected, or they've been picked on, or whatever. That will also affect their learning. And sometimes I think the key thing with this is raising awareness. A lot of the time there's nothing we can do about it, unfortunately. We can't be everywhere all at the same time. We can't have everybody calm and in a Zen mode, for want of a better description. But if we are aware, we might pick up and say, okay, maybe I need to change the pace. I need to change the mood of the lesson because the students need the distraction, or they need to change the rhythm in the brain. And that just helps us to be aware that that's why they're not responding or going on. Something else is happening in the brain. It's not necessarily my teaching, but it could well be that we need to do something, and we'll look at that a little bit later as to what we can do. So that moves me quite nicely on to attention span. And I'm just looking at the clock, because it's around 20 minutes or just under 20 minutes that I have been rabbiting on at you. So this is quite apt to look at this part. So we all know that our students lose attention quite quickly. So maybe we have their attention at the beginning of the lesson, and then somehow it just seems to evaporate, disappear. Not necessarily because the content is not engaging, but sometimes it's just natural attention span has disappeared. Okay. So there's what's called the 90-20-8 rule. Okay. So according to this rule, we are completely and alert for the first 8 minutes. So in other words, for the last 12 minutes, you have started to maybe lose, or there's been a dip in the concentration. You're not quite as alert and as attentive as you were for the first 8 minutes of what I spoke about, and you would probably remember more from those first 8 minutes and a little bit less towards the second part, the last 12 minutes. But unfortunately, after 20 minutes, and this is this magic number, our attention begins to drop quite significantly. Okay, so 8 minutes, you've got great, clear complete attention, and then it slowly starts to drop off, and after 20 minutes we're really starting to see a significant drop in focus or in attention. And between 60 and 90 minutes, so luckily today I am not going to be rabbiting on and talking at you for 60 minutes. As I said, I hope to wrap things up so we have 15 minutes, so we won't reach the 60-minute mark, so that your attention span will hopefully not reach 0. But that's not always guaranteed, but that's always something to bear in mind. And if we think about it, that is why a lot of the lessons in school are 55 minutes or 60 minutes, because we know that at that time the attention span is absolutely gone. So when we have longer lessons, we need to look at putting in brain breaks, time to refresh, change of activity, again, things that we can look at a little bit later on. Now, the next thing that we can look at or think about is a thing called neuroplasticity. So there's been research, there's been studies where people believe that we learn things, and the best time to learn anything was when we were children, and then as we got older, we used to lose more and more gray cells, and the brain basically started to shrink and just got smaller and smaller. As we got older, the brain got smaller. But they've actually discovered that the brain is quite plastic, and we can learn new things at any age. We don't have to be young whippersnappers. We can learn at any time, and it's just how we use, and it's understanding how the brain works, and then we can use that to our advantage, and we can learn new things. So the brain is quite plastic. It's not set, rigid. Okay? So once we believe that the brain grew as we grew, once we reached adulthood, and again, adulthood, we can define where that line is, but at some point, people used to say at a certain age, we were fully cooked, brain was ready, everything was okay. And then slowly but surely, we started to lose pieces of it with old age, until eventually we became old and senile and forgot everything and couldn't remember a number of things. Where did I put the car keys? What did I do? Etc. But fortunately, science has learned, science has evolved, and they've actually proven this to be incorrect. So in our brain, we have what are called a series of neurons. So the best way that I can describe this is it's a bit like a spider web. It's a network of nerve endings, and these have pathways, and these pathways link up, and information is passed through these pathways in the brain. And there was a guy called Hebb, and he came up with a law that basically he says that neurons that fire together, so because there's an electrical current between them, these neurons that are firing together at the same time, they wire together and they make then a solid connection, and they make a new neural pathway. So the neurons are floating around. The moment we can make a connection, we've then created a new pathway. And the more we use a skill, the more we do something with the knowledge that we have or that we have learned, the stronger the neural pathway becomes. So we could take, for example, I think the simplest is learning a manual skill. Let's say we're learning, or even better still, as human beings, we tend to get into a habit or a routine. We move to a new city, and we find our route to school. On the first day, we need to think carefully. Okay, I need to turn left, and I need to turn right, and I need to go here. And eventually, after doing that a number of times without being consciously aware of it, suddenly we can go on that pathway, we go on that route without thinking about it. We do it as second nature. It becomes automatic. And till such time that we can go on that route, and without thinking, maybe we want to use half of that route and we want to go somewhere else. And if we don't concentrate, we end up going on the normal route to school. But hey, it's Saturday today and I actually want to go and see my mother, and I've got to turn left here instead of going straight on. But we do it without thinking because we've created that pathway, and that pathway is so strong that it just becomes second nature. And the example that I wanted to use was maybe somebody's learning to play basketball or to shoot a basket. Eventually, they train, they practice. The more they train, we've got this little pathway, little link through the brain. The more we use it, the stronger it gets. So we've got maybe one neuron firing together, then maybe we've got another one firing together. And if we notice, the more we get, that pathway is then 4 fingers thick instead of just a tiny little pathway. And we all know that we have bad habits, and bad habits are difficult to break. And this will hopefully explain why, because once something becomes a habit, we've got possibly more than that together, but we've got a pretty strong connection. And in order to break that connection, we can't just suddenly say, okay, I'm going to sever those ties. What I need to do, excuse me, is I've got to create a new pathway because this one still exists. So I've got to create a new pathway here, and eventually that pathway is going to become strong, and this pathway will then slowly fade away because this one takes priority. Okay, so it's a case of making those connections stronger and stronger, reinforcing them, and the basketball players practicing on a regular basis, on a daily basis, and building up and doing the same movement, the same thing, but using the same information, but in different ways. Okay, so to replace a habit, we've got to learn and consolidate a new one. So we can't just learn the new habit. We've got to work on it. We've got to consolidate it. We've got to build that new highway, for want of a better way, because it starts as a tiny little pathway, but we want it to become a highway because then a lot of information, like on a highway, a lot of cars can travel, a lot of information can travel backwards and forwards on this particular pathway. Then if we go back now a little bit to the brain and learning, we've got a bit of information. So this is a quote from Rachel Maria Paling, who set up the Efficient Language Coaching, and I happen to be a professional language coach as well, so hence me sort of dabbing into a little bit of this. And Rachel says that children from the age of 0 to 7, they don't have their prefrontal cortex developed. Okay. So they learn by repetition, and they learn by doing. So if any of you have young children, okay, of your own, or you think back to when you were a child or how children learn, they don't pick up a book. Mum doesn't give them a book and say, learn this. They learn from hearing, repeating, they do things, they make mistakes. So it's all implicit learning. Okay? Whereas from the age of 7, the prefrontal cortex starts developing. And with that, we start developing critical, logical, and analytical skills. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for all this critical, logic, analytical thinking. Okay. Now we can start to learn through association as well as the learning by repetition and learning by doing. So now we're starting to use explicit learning. Oops. Let me see if I can go back one slide. Okay. But when we become adults, or when we reach adulthood, adults can engage with both explicit and implicit learning at the same time. Okay. So here they're moving from implicit to more explicit, but as adults, we're using both. We have the ability to deal with both of those things at the same time. And if you notice that these things go up in stages of 7, and at one point people used to say that at the age of 21, the prefrontal cortex was fully developed, and it's actually been proven that it's a little bit later, it's more towards the early 30s, that the prefrontal cortex is actually fully developed. Here it's starting to develop and it continues to develop. So let's look at the teenage brain. So as I said, the prefrontal cortex, the rational part of the brain, isn't fully developed until our late 20s or 30s. The adults, we as adults think with our prefrontal cortex, rational, logical, analytical. But the teens, most of your students are processing information with the amygdala. They are processing it through emotional, not through rational, logical, analytical thinking. It's all through emotion. Okay? So their decision-making centers are still developing, so they use the emotional part of the brain. But the teenage brain is naturally, as we know, as we are aware, it's very hungry for stimulation, but by the same token, it's easily bored. They are primed to learn quickly, they pick things up quickly, but any kind of addiction, and unfortunately addiction to mobile phones, gaming, etc., it's also a form of learning, and they get addicted much quicker than they would do later on in life. Okay, I've got drugs and substances here, but it's quite harsh. But I'm talking more about video games, different things. So they pick up that addiction, that attraction much quicker than they would do later on, because they're learning so quickly and they're looking for that immediate stimulation. So what are we going to do about this? So how can we help our learners? We've raised the awareness, we know. So we need to expose the students to what they've learned, but they need to be exposed using what we call spaced repetition. So today, maybe tomorrow, then in a week's time, then maybe a little bit later. So we basically kind of repeating, getting them to remember, reusing, recycling, but not just sort of do it every day, but we need to increase the space to make the memory work better. We can also use microlearning. We can use an expression which Scott Thornbury, I believe, came up with the expression to grease the path. It's having information in the brain, in the long-term memory, and if the more we access it, the easier it is. It comes and goes much quicker. It's like anything. If something is well-oiled, it moves quickly. If we don't use it, the information stays at the back of our brains, and it's there. We don't forget it completely, but it's not easily accessible to us. And as with microlearning, we can learn one objective at a time, but obviously that is very, very time consuming. We don't have time to just do one thing. Okay? And we need to decide what we need to know versus what is nice to know. So let's have a look at some examples. Now, I think it's very important that I make it clear that I am not a course book writer. I don't promote, I don't sell MacMillan products, so I'm not here to push a particular product. I came across Upskill English. I found it very useful and it kind of ticked the boxes for microlearning. So I would really like to sort of use these examples to show you from this particular set of course books how we can use microlearning, or how microlearning can be incorporated into course books. So if we look here, for example, going back to what I said about the brain is a bit like a map, and a lot of the time we like to learn. The brain likes to see things and likes to see the connection. Imagine these as neural pathways. The brain likes to sort of see the link. I've got this link, and then I can add to this link, and this link then becomes stronger and stronger. So this kind of graphical representation, or this kind of layout, also helps the students, helps the brain to make connections, to see connections, and ultimately to reinforce the connections. Another one here where we've got things here, we've got asking for directions as opposed to giving directions. And again, colors help, but the layout, getting the students, and the students are then working with the information. They've got some information that they have already, that they can build on information that they have. So again, they're taking an existing pathway and just to add to the existing pathway. And that's why it's always useful when teaching something new, if it's possible, to link it back to something they already know. Does two things. A, it kind of links up and brings another neuron close to another neuron, so it makes it stronger. And also it then helps to recycle, to revisit, to have the space repetition. Remember, we did this last week. It's a bit of a reminder, okay, that's going to help you, or that connects to this. So the brain starts to see the spider web and build up the web of information that is already there and make those connections stronger. Here, for example, we're now looking at having had the previous page here with giving directions. So they've worked with the directions. I apologize that sometimes when you scan they're not that clear, but obviously if you have access to the course book you can see the information. But the idea was just to see that you've got, excuse me, can you tell me how to get to, for example, the library. Okay, so asking or giving directions. So they're practicing, they're getting the information, they're working with the information they have. And then we've got using that information. The next step is to then look at a dialogue, work with the dialogue. Okay, then we've got the next step that obviously then we can practice the dialogue, and we're then starting to take it from one to role play to building step by step, and keep that process going. I think what is also important is, and if we use the course books that have been carefully designed and created, that 20-minute gap, the 20-minute, not gap, but the 20-minute period is also kind of worked into a lot of the course books, where it's kind of like the activity will change, the pace of the lesson. But if we're aware, we can then sort of plan our lessons. If you've got a 60-minute lesson, we can look at having kind of a change of activity at least twice in the lesson, after 20 minutes and then after a further 40 minutes, just to keep the brain fresh and to keep them doing something different, changing, so that they're keeping their attention going. Lack of attention, lack of memory, lack of learning. Okay, and then obviously here, so in the beginning, they're practicing the dialogue, and then the next step is to change the highlighted parts to different places and alternative directions. So again, they're building it up, and then they're using what they know and adding to it. And now instead of the cinema, to the bank, to your grandparents' house, whatever else, so that they're starting to expand and seeing and building new connections, new neurons, new possibilities that they can then start to see how things work. Then obviously when they have the, in this particular course book, they have an exit test. And again, now they will be revising, revisiting, recycling, reusing words, expressions, vocabulary that they've come across during that particular unit, or during a period of learning, a section of learning. So again, revisiting, because if we go back to the forgetting curve, we do need to recycle, we need to re-engage, we need to revisit. Otherwise, the information is basically lost. And then it's a case of having to restart the process again. So if we can get it into their longer term memory, it's there, then they can start working with it, they can start building it, they can start building these pathways and building their information. So I did say that I would aim to finish at 1:45. I do apologize if I kind of rushed through a little bit of the stuff at the end because I was conscious I did want to leave some time for comments, for feedback, for any questions that hopefully you might have, and I will more to the point, I will hopefully be able to answer. So let me go back to the studio and see if Romina is there. Can you hear me, Romina?
Okay. Hi, Richard. Thank you. That was really, really, really interesting. I have to say that, and I was reading the comments as well. I'm not sure you could read them, to be
I
honest.
couldn't see any of the comments, so
Okay. So they were saying while you were talking, they were saying, really only 20 minutes. So right from the beginning, I mean, I have to say that I was also surprised because we're not really used to thinking about these 20 minutes, like only 20 minutes, and then it already decreases. And then there were other comments about the fact that it was really interesting because if you know about the brain, then you also know how to, interact maybe with the teenagers, and the fact that they are really attached to this way of learning that involves the amygdala.
yeah,
Also this, I mean, that's why we always struggle, right? Because
exactly. And I think the key thing is I know it's impossible for people to necessarily take in all the information and to study it, but for me, when I realized that, and I thought, okay, so not to defend the teenagers, but there is a reason for their behavior, and it's almost out of their control. So if we can sort of say, okay, that's how they are, so how can we work with them, or how can we use that to our advantage? We're not fighting against something. So we can say, okay, so if they are that way, maybe we can use emotion in a positive way and get them emotionally engaged. And if they are addicted to things, maybe we can find things that interest them. And it might be a case of sort of, can we link it to something that motivates them or interests them? Maybe it'll make the topic more memorable.
Absolutely. So, for example, I was just thinking, do you think that what maybe books are now developing, which is social emotional learning and all these parts, do you think that could be useful for the
Absolutely,
future?
because I think that's the key thing, that until recently, certainly a lot of people were not aware of this emotional side of the learning. I mean, in the past, it was IQ, and IQ was everything. Now they're talking about social intelligence and emotional intelligence. And, as I said, it struck me when there was a situation with my mother where she felt that I think it was my tone of voice or what I'd said, but that stuck with her, as I say, for 20 minutes, where other pieces of information, new information, was gone in less than 5 minutes. And when I realized that strong emotion where she felt I had been potentially unkind or said something in a harsh way, that stuck. And sometimes we can sort of say, okay, so maybe, and I'm not saying that we are like this, but sometimes we might tell a student, no, that was the wrong answer, or we might give them feedback which we don't perceive as being bad or having a strong emotion, but they might perceive it in a different way. And then we wonder why they've switched off, because maybe they've kind of taken it in the wrong way. So it's just a case of being aware of these emotions. We don't need to wrap them up in cotton wool, but it's just the awareness to say, okay, maybe something's going on that I wasn't aware of. It can just kind of influence or inform, should I say, maybe more than influence the teaching. A little bit of knowledge. Sometimes it can be dangerous, sure. We're not neuroscientists. We don't need to say that we know the brain, but a little bit of information can be useful.
Absolutely.
To sort of say, okay, maybe that it makes sense.
And by reading here at the comments, I can also see that Carmen, for example, said, I realized we often have to give them our grammar in chunks.
Absolutely.
So even that could be maybe linked to microlearning.
Sure. And also, I think the other thing, as an English language teacher, when you're teaching them 1/10 at a time, how useful I certainly find it is to say, okay, so remember we did the present tense. Let's do a quick recap. Now we're doing the present perfect. Remember that information, and then what is the link, or how is that different? It helps the students, okay, so that's where, and if they start to build up this bridge and this idea. Because the problem is that sometimes as teachers, we know it all, we understand it all, but we forget that for them it's all new, and sometimes they need to digest before they can build to the next level.
I totally agree. And there's another comment by Juicy saying that as teachers, we should focus our lessons on the emotional involvement of our pupils. It could be interesting, help them to share their personal feelings, emotion, hidden and interior thoughts.
Absolutely, yeah. Because, if you can, because what's going on in their brain is what's occupying their attention. So if you can get them to talk about something which engages them or interests them, for me, a perfect example, and I know that this is quite difficult in schools because of mobile phones, but if you want to get somebody talking and you say, on page 67, there's a picture of 3 children in a park, describe what you can see. Well, for them, there's no connection. There's no emotional connection to that picture. It's just a picture in a book. If, for example, you had the opportunity and say, take a photo on your phone, or take a photo where you are with your brothers and sisters, you playing in the park, and talk about that photo, the students have got lots to talk about. They've got memories, they've got engagement, they've got emotions, and you're probably going to get them to talk a lot about that photo. But in the book, they say, well, what can I talk about? I can just describe the basic things. But if we can, not always easy.
And do you think that this could be aligned with the requirements that maybe have to be made at school? For example, the thing about the picture is quite interesting. I could think about the fact that maybe this could be a nice activity even in state schools, because
if we sort of say, okay, because now it's becoming more of an issue with mobile phones, but maybe it could be a case of, okay, bring in a picture, a physical picture, print out a picture, or if you can't, think of a picture and describe what the picture is about, but a picture you've taken, not one from the book.
Exactly.
Some people complain because they can't print it out because they don't have a printer at home, or they have to go and pay 50 cents to print it out at the stationery shop. But you could say, okay, if you can't, or cut out a picture from your favorite magazine, or bring in a toy, bring in something that has some kind of emotional importance for you.
Absolutely. There's another comment that says, from Tiziana, that says that one of the best methods I've ever used is the emotional and relational one. So absolutely, everyone agrees, right, that this kind of method really helps microlearning, first of all, but also as also the other methods that you were listing, like spaced repetition. I think that that could be also really useful.
Because I think the key thing is all of these methods that we've spoken about, it boils down to the fact that we can teach a number of things, but if we don't teach it in small bite-sized chunks, the students aren't going to learn it. So, trying to teach them the past and the present tense, or all of the present tense in one go. Better to break it down into small pieces, get them to use that, remember that. Tomorrow we do another piece and build it up rather than trying to put too much into the lesson. Maybe space it out, spread it out. I know it's not possible to stretch it too far because of the curriculum, but it's a case of saying, okay, let's spend 10 minutes on that, do a bit of recycling, do something else, and then basically build on, sort of the little.
Absolutely.
Chunks.
And I just have one last question, which is
Sure.
just out of curiosity, and then we'll wrap it up if no one has other questions in the chat. Can I ask you how you got interested in the brain and how the language learning works? It's just
I kind of stumbled across it when I heard about neuro language coaching, and I just basically followed that pathway. I've now qualified as a teacher trainer in neuro language coaching, and it just kind of fitted quite nicely. It gelled with my personal needs and requirements as a teacher to understand, to know what was going on. And so it was quite nice to dabble, because I think that's all I've really done. I haven't really managed to go too deep into it. But I find it sort of fits in quite nicely with the rest of the.
That's interesting. Even I think process. When we think about the way of helping teachers in their personal and professional development, neurological elements could also be interesting.
Absolutely.
Because that's something that if you know how the brain works, then you know how to help other students probably. Yes. So that's quite nice. Okay, I don't see other questions now. If you have final comments, everyone, don't worry. You can always use the chat. I would like to thank you, everybody, for being here today. And thank you, Richard, for this great session. Everyone was saying that it was really interesting, and I couldn't agree more, to be honest. So I'll wait for you, for everyone, in our next session on the 28th of October. We're going to have another session, not with Richard this time, but Richard will come back. So stay tuned for Richard. And on the 28th of October, we're going to have a session about AI. So it's going to be at 4. So same time, for Italian time. And it's gonna be at least, or some about 1 hour. So pretty much the same structure as today. I was reading the comments, the final comments now. The connection between our brain works. Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. Okay, Carmen is saying that AI is a spot on. So we are trying to be innovative as well. So thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. Thank you again, Richard. And
my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for your comments and your feedback. It's been a pleasure to spend time with you. And thanks once again to MacMillan for the opportunity.
Thank you, everyone. And don't forget, you'll find your attestati in the section mondadorieducation.it/attestati. So thanks a lot and enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.